Korea was a protectorate of Japan for 35 years. During this time, the peninsula was unified but heavily subjugated by the Imperial Japanese. Even prior to this, for thousands of years, the Korean peninsula was unified under a series of dynasties and empires similar to those of the Chinese. When the Japanese were expelled from the area, there was infighting as to what the Koreans should be ruled as: communism or capitalism, authoritarianism or despotism. What is the lesser of these two evils? The Soviet Union felt that it was communism, a system where the workers theoretically own the means of production, wealth, goods, and land is redistributed. Their motto is, from each according to their ability, to each according to their need. This idea was popular with the North's enigmatic leader, Kim Il-sung, who wanted to establish his own version of communism called Juche, which instilled, at least what he thought, self-reliant Korean values that the Korean people have always believed in. The United States, in its never-ending quest to contain and eradicate communism, felt that installing their own enigmatic leader who was ruthless, authoritarian, and at least democratically elected was better than communism. These two ideas split the peninsula in two, literally and ideologically. Then the UN stepped in to take control. They generally sided with the West, but ultimately they wanted peace. To achieve this goal, the UN encountered opposition from both internal and external forces, explored the idea of peace in a war-torn and unstable country, and exchanged many political values that still have an influence on the world as we know it today. As the will for a unified Korea increased, so did tensions between the democratic South and the communist North. Kim Il-sung, the enigmatic leader of the North, wished for a unified Korea so that his brothers to the South can work together in harmony again. Syngman Rhee, the corrupt and brutal president of the South, wished for the same, but not under the leadership of Kim. Rhee, paranoid about the communist intervention, massacred several innocent people with opposing views, and subsequently lowered the number of communists in the country. However, Kim was much more willing to take action against the South, enlisting in the advisory help of the Soviets by reaching out to Stalin and military aid and soldiers from Mao and China. On the 25th of June in 1950, the Korean People's Army crossed the previously agreed upon 38th parallel demarcation zone into the Southern Territory. This got the interest of the United Nations, and especially the United States. The UN passed the UN Security Council Resolution 82, universally painting and denouncing the North's invasion of the South. However, at this time the USSR was not participating in the Security Council because the usurped Republic of China, now stuck in Taiwan, had the seat, and they recognized the People's Republic of China as the legitimate owner of that position. The Security Council then hastily published UNSCR 83, which called for the members of the UN, remember at this time to not include the USSR or the People's Republic of China, to intervene in Korea.
While North Korea was invading South Korea, the United Nations rushed to the aid of those fighting against communism through artillery and militaristic strategy. However, the United States provided ground and air coverage for the Koreans without authorization from the Security Council. This threw the United Nations into upheaval with the Security Council, as the United Nations directly disobeyed the Atlantic Charter. At this point, the UN was still striving to restore peace despite the turmoil it brought upon itself. Hence arose the United Command, the United States Command of the Koreans. The United Nations encountered several issues during this war, such as an incapability to fulfill obligations dictated by the Atlantic Charter. Subsequently, the United Nations ceased to have absolute direct involvement in political strategy and war tactic, but instead made recommendations to those involved in the fight. The United Nations had, for the first time, made extreme alterations to its military titles and defended its own actions in Korea, mostly through the United States government. The UN was troubled internally by their decision to invade. The Soviets were still boycotting the Security Council, so they did not have pressure from that angle, but there was still pressure from the non-aligned countries like India. They felt that the UN was overstepping its boundaries as a peaceful organization. Many, like the US, argued that war is necessary for peace, which is somewhat counterintuitive. The term "si vis pacem para bellum" means if you want peace, prepare for war. This was the mindset of the UN at the time. However, the US and NATO were sure that fending off communism was important for world security. Many countries in the UN did not share this sentiment, thusly were taken back by the UN's decision to intervene in Korea. They said it was peacekeeping, but is war truly peace? The UN was forced to exchange many differing ideas of peace in order to quell the quarreling countries. As the war raged on, so too did the debates in the General Assembly and Security Council. Is victory worth the cost? Will this conflict escalate? It seemed so. The UN forces got pushed back all the way to the southern point of the Korean peninsula, and the UN member states were outraged. Was all of this for nothing? But then the tides turned and the UN forces pushed all the way back to the Chinese border. Then the Chinese stepped in. Their forces supplemented the North Koreans, and then the UN got pushed all the way back to the 38th parallel. Then it ended. A stalemate. Was this what the UN wanted? The US was not pleased with this, but the UN achieved its goal: peace. July 27, 1953 was the day when the Armistice Agreement was ratified. This armistice ended hostilities until a treaty could be ratified. But this treaty was never ratified. The UN did not know what to do. They wanted peace, so they were forced to explore different options on how to keep that peace. The eventual outcome was a so-called demilitarized zone built by the UN, South Korea, North Korea, and the US that kept each country away from each other. The name is ironic, however, as it is one of the most heavily guarded zones in the world. However, it has kept the peace between the two countries for decades, thusly fulfilling its purpose. The United Nations went from a fledgling organization of the victorious countries after World War II to a respectable and meaningful organization during the events of the Korean War. It also set the precedent of the United States leading many military campaigns. This also heightened tensions during the Cold War. By the time the war was ending, the USSR and the USA were both capable of mutually assured atomic destruction. The world was thankful that there was never any direct US and Soviet fighting. However, it was deemed a proxy war between the two superpowers. This was the first of many Soviet and US close calls that could have thrown the world into nuclear winter. The United Nations stepped up onto the international stage. It was originally just another League of Nations and was expected not to have any real power and fail within a couple of years. But the UN didn't do this. It succeeded and was even able to stop another world war. They were able to allow the US and the USSR to cooperate and even discuss options together as they, along with China, the UK, and France, could decide on the security of the world. The Korean War in America is sometimes known as the Forgotten War. It fell out of people's minds because of World War II before it and the much larger scale Vietnam War after it. Children, let alone adults, have no recollection of this war because the American populace, and for that matter, especially the Europeans, did not think of this as a world-changing event. There was much more important events happening, at least in the mindset of the world. But the Korean War doesn't deserve to be forgotten. It changed the political landscape from everyone being afraid of each other to everyone cooperating for the most part. The United Nations brokered a deal which ended hostilities in Korea, which set a precedent for peacekeeping as one of the major functions of the UN. The UN continues to this day to station peacekeeping soldiers on the border of North and South Korea. They facilitate all meetings between the two countries and help them resolve disputes. This is a common practice of the UN, seen in places like Cyprus, Kosovo, and Morocco. The want for world peace was greater than ever after the events of World War II, and the UN did that. They kept the world out of any major worldwide conflicts for the next 70 years after its creation. The UN did its job in Korea, proved it could be a major world influence, and continues to do so today.
The Korean War had lasting effects on the world as we know it, including the position of the Koreans and especially the United Nations themselves. Without the intervention of the United Nations, the Koreas could have possibly undergone the war that couldn't be forgotten. Because it was the first time the United Nations demonstrated its purpose, the effects on the organization were also sempiternal. Once the United Nations delved into the war, they were able to persevere through every hardship they encountered. Whether it be politically or ideologically, many nations exchanged values, ideas, logic, and tactics. Most importantly, they exchanged imposing views of ideologies. Besides numerous threats belonging to the highly powerful, possibly perilous disputes between the USA and Russia, the United Nations still managed to keep global peace. Through this motivation to restore peace, the United Nations explored every option and exhausted all methods to bring their destination to reality. Even though there is still dissension between the two countries, the United Nations continues to be involved and strives to restore peace.